Hello and welcome back. In this demo, we'll learn how to invoke workflows in our automation project and use arguments. So far in this course, we've worked with only one workflow, main.xaml. However, breaking our processes into smaller workflows is paramount to good project design. Dedicated workflows allow independent testing of components, whilst encouraging team collaboration by working on separate files at the same time. So how do you think we pass data between the parent and the child workflows? When working with multiple workflows, instead of variables, we use arguments to pass data between the parent and the child workflows. Arguments pass data between workflows, while variables pass data between activities. Some exceptions do apply, which we'll talk about a bit later. But it's time to start building. First, we'll create a new workflow with the sequence layout that we can later invoke in main. This workflow takes two double values as input, calculates their sum, and outputs it back to main. Let's rename the sequence and add a descriptive annotation. Let's create an argument which we'll call sum for now. An argument is a way of providing more information. An argument's direction tells the application where the information stored in it is supposed to go. Now, there are three directions that we can choose for an argument: in, out, and in/out. In arguments can be used only to pass data into the invoked workflow. Out only to extract data from the invoked workflow. And in/out works both ways. The property option is used to indicate that an argument is not currently in use without having to delete it from the list. We'll use the sum argument to pass the result of the calculation back to main. Thus, we'll choose the direction out. The types that are available to choose from for variables are also available for arguments. So, besides the list that we have here, we can click on Browse for Types and choose the one that we need. In our case, we need double. An argument direction should always prefix the name of the argument. Since we chose out for the sum, let's use that as a prefix. Let's create another pair of double arguments to pass the input from main. We'll name the first one in first value and the type as double. And the second one, let's name it in second value and of type double. Alright, for the arguments with direction in, we can choose a default value which can be used. But any value that we pass to the argument from the invoked workflow will overwrite this one. As soon as we create arguments in the Arguments panel, they appear in the Data Manager panel as well. Let's log the value of the execution info. For this, let's create an in/out string argument that we'll use to display the current step of the calculation. We'll name this one IO execution info. And then add the actual calculation step. We'll assign the result of the first value plus the second value to the out sum argument. Let's add another assign activity to set the IO execution info argument to calculation completed. Okay, we're done here, so let's save this workflow. Back to main, let's invoke the calculate sum workflow that we've just created. We need an Invoke Workflow Activity to do this. However, we can drag and drop the workflow that we want to invoke from the project panel, thus having the activity automatically configured. Additionally, if we right-click the project name, we have the option to import files and select the .xaml file that we want to use. The About Automation project documentation covers this in more depth. Now let's rename the sequence and add annotations. The next step is to configure the mapping of the arguments. Let's click Import Arguments. This opens an Arguments panel where we can map the input parameters of the invoked workflow to the variables of the current workflow. We'll press Ctrl+K in the Value field for OutSum to create a new variable in main for it. Here, we'll need a variable because the argument is of type out, and it needs a place to store the value retrieved from the invoked workflow. For arguments of the type in, we can pass both variables or hard-coded values. Let's assign 2 hard-coded values for this example. For the in-out argument, let's create another variable as well. Once done, click OK to save the configuration. Now before we move on, let's quickly see the properties of an invoked workflow. We have the Common, Input, Log, and MISC sections. Learn more about each property on the Invoke Workflow file documentation page at the end of this lesson. So far, so good. Next, let's log the execution info variable as well as the result. For this, we'll add a log message activity with execution info plus result is plus sum.toString as the message. Before we run the workflow, let's assign an initial value to the execution info variable that will be passed on to the invoked workflow. One last thing to do is to run the project in debug mode and see what happens. The workflow is executed successfully. When checking the output panel, we can see the log message with the execution information before calculating the sum. The value calculation completed set by the IO execution info argument after calculating the sum. And the 2 hard-coded values are passed to the calculate sum workflow via 2 in arguments. Their sum is assigned to the OutSum argument and then passed back to main and logged. Okay, but how does an invoked workflow behave when arguments are renamed? Let's check it out. For demo purposes, we'll create a second workflow and we'll call it Renaming Arguments. And let's create 3 arguments. In first number, in second number, and out result. All 3 of the type double. Next, let's add an assign activity. Configure it to assign the values of the 2 in arguments to the result one. And save it. Let's invoke this second workflow in main by using the Invoke Workflow Activity. Great, let's configure the mapping of the arguments. We'll click on Import Arguments. Provide default values for the in arguments. And provide a variable for out result in main using the Ctrl+K method. And save. The arguments are configured. Now let's go back to our second workflow and change the name of an argument here. For demonstration, let's change in first number to in last number. We see that the renamed argument updates itself in all occurrences. Alright, let's save this and go to main again. We'll click on Import Arguments of the second workflow and the argument is renamed. However, the mapping must be redone, so let's re-add the value 50.5. And this is it for this demo. So, in this second demo, we saw how to invoke another workflow in main, and how arguments help us to pass data between the child and parent workflow. For more practice on this topic, try to explore the robustness of arguments and their directions to pass data between multiple workflows. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.